It was the first Halloween I had spent in my new house. I'd moved in just a few months earlier, a modest two-story on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, and this seemed like the perfect excuse to invite friends over and finally fill the place with life. I had spent the afternoon decorating, hanging orange and black lights, carving pumpkins that now flickered faintly on the porch, and setting up bowls of candy and snacks. Inside, I had arranged the living room to accommodate a small crowd. A corner with a few chairs and the couch for sitting, the kitchen cleared for drinks, and a small speaker playing soft, seasonal music to set the mood. Everything felt ordinary, even cheerful, the kind of warmth and familiarity that makes a house feel like a home. As my friends arrived, laughter and chatter filled the rooms, spilling out into the hallway and bouncing off the walls. Costumes ranged from elaborate to homemade. Witches, superheroes, a few characters from popular shows, but no one seemed out of place. The drinks flowed, the snacks disappeared quickly, and for a while, I forgot entirely about the small tension I had felt earlier in the day, a nagging thought about the neighborhood being too quiet, the shadows outside the windows too long. It wasn't until a few hours and that I noticed him. I was standing near the kitchen counter, pouring a drink, when I felt the shift in the atmosphere. The laughter and music seemed to dim, or perhaps it was just my perception, but I became aware of a presence I hadn't recognized before. In the far corner of the living room, near the edge of the hallway leading to the bedrooms, a man stood. I hadn't seen him arrive, and for a moment, I assumed it was someone's costume or a friend trying to scare me. But there was something about the way he held himself that didn't fit the context of the party. He was tall, wearing a jacket that looked old, frayed at the sleeves and shoulders, colors faded to a dull brown. There was nothing festive about it. His hands hung loosely at his sides, and he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the group of friends who were gathered on the couch and chairs, talking and laughing. I studied him for a few seconds, trying to place him. None of my friends acknowledged him. No one else seemed to see him, which immediately made me uneasy. I approached him slowly, trying to maintain a casual posture, telling myself that it was probably someone my friends had invited and I had forgotten, or a neighbor who had wandered in. As I got closer, I realized he was older than I had first thought, perhaps in his 60s, with pale skin that seemed a little too taut for his age, and hair thin and combed back. I noticed the dust along the cuffs of his jacket, the faint streaks of dirt on his shoes. He didn't speak or react. I stopped just a few feet away and tilted my head, trying to gauge whether he needed help, whether he was lost or confused. But he simply turned his head slowly toward the front door and walked straight toward it. I followed him, expecting him to open the door or at least ask for something. My hand reached for the doorknob as he moved, and just as he reached it, he was gone. I blinked, the chill running down my spine, almost physical. The door was still locked, the deadbolt engaged, exactly as I'd left it. I looked around quickly, searching for him in the living room, the hallway, even the kitchen. Nothing. No sign that he had been there at all. The living room was unchanged. The party continued, my friends still chatting, unaware of the man who had been standing in their midst. A creeping sense of disbelief settled in, the kind that made my stomach knot and my mind race for rational explanations. Maybe someone had been hiding in the hallway. Some of my friends hadn't noticed. Maybe I had misperceived the light and shadows, a combination of flickering pumpkin candles and the room's overhead lights creating an illusion of movement. I checked the windows, locked with the curtains drawn, and the back door, which was bolted and secure. There was no other entrance. My heart slowed a little as I tried to breathe through the tension, but the image of him standing there, watching, refused to fade. The party continued around me, oblivious, but I couldn't focus. Every shadow in the room seemed sharper. Every reflection in the glass from the windows or picture frames seemed to shift subtly when I looked away. I kept thinking I saw him out of the corner of my eye, in the hallway, near the staircase, but every time I turned fully, there was nothing. The music played, the laughter continued, but a thread of unease ran through me that I couldn't untangle. I tried to ground myself logically. Someone could have left, of course. A neighbor, a delivery person, a friend who had snuck in, forgotten to introduce themselves. But the locked door contradicted that. The rational part of my mind fought the instinctive fear growing in my chest. I checked every door and window again, confirming each one was secure. Nothing. The man was not outside. The hallway and the rooms were empty. Eventually, I forced myself to return to the party, trying to ignore the lingering image in the corner of the living room. I told myself it didn't matter, that the imagination could play tricks under the right conditions: shadows, dim lighting, the faint reflection of a jacket hanging on a chair. I focused on pouring drinks, arranging snacks, and keeping the conversation flowing. The initial shock passed enough that I could function, but I didn't feel fully present. Every time someone moved in the room, my gaze flicked to the corner, expecting him to reappear. By the end of the night, as guests trickled out, I walked around the house, checking the doors, the locks, the windows. Everything remained secure, exactly as it should have been. There was no sign of anyone else having been there. The living room was empty, chairs pushed in, glasses cleared. Nothing indicated that the man had ever existed beyond the fleeting, solid impression my mind had captured. After the party, I stayed awake for hours, replaying the events in my head, trying to reconcile what I had seen with what was possible. The man had been real, I was certain of it. I had felt him standing there, had seen the folds of his worn jacket, the way his hands hung loosely, the direction of his gaze. And yet, there was no evidence. Nothing that could explain his presence without defying logic. In the weeks that followed, I checked security footage from my porch cameras, but the angles didn't cover the interior rooms. I asked neighbors if anyone had mentioned an intruder or stranger in the area, but no one had. Nothing appeared on the local news or police reports. It was as if the man had existed for those few minutes and then vanished entirely. I have never had another Halloween party at that house. I didn't need to. The memory of that night is vivid enough to keep me cautious. I never saw him again, never caught a glimpse outside or inside the house, and yet the feeling remains. The awareness that someone had been there, fully present, watching without interacting, and then disappeared without explanation, is enough. I understand logically that he must have entered in some way I hadn't considered, or that my mind had combined fragments of light, shadow, and fatigue into a coherent but deceptive image. Yet the experience was entirely human, entirely plausible, and entirely unsettling. It left me with the sense that ordinary spaces can briefly host extraordinary, unexplainable events, and that sometimes the most terrifying thing is how easily reality itself can feel unstable. I've been working at the pumpkin patch for a few weeks before Halloween. It wasn't much, just a seasonal job to help out during the harvest. The farm wasn't big, but it was enough to keep me busy. Kids would come in, picking pumpkins for their Halloween carvings, running around like they owned the place. The usual farm stuff: hauling hay bales, cleaning up the fields, and making sure everyone had a good time. The pay wasn't great, but it was a way to kill time and make a little money. The owner, Mr. Baldwin, was an older man, quiet for the most part, and he mostly left me to my own devices after the day was done. It was a Thursday night, the week before Halloween, when I found myself staying late to finish up. The last family had left a couple of hours ago. The sun had set, and the field was bathed in that soft, fading light that seemed to stretch on forever. The patch itself was small, just a couple of acres, with rows of pumpkins sprawled across the ground in uneven clusters. Most of them were small, a few were huge, and a couple looked like they had been overripe for weeks. The kind of pumpkins that would make you think twice before carving. I had already swept the walkways and gathered the scattered trash from the farm stands. The only thing left to do was tidy up the crates of pumpkins stacked near the edge of the field. I grabbed the broom from the back of the barn and started pushing the dirt in the rows back into place, trying to get done quickly. It was the kind of task that, even though it didn't require much thought, had a way of making time crawl. The air was cool and still, the faint smell of earth and rotting leaves hanging in the air. As I moved down one of the rows, I noticed a pumpkin off to the side. It was much larger than the others, a deep, rich orange that looked almost out of place amid the smaller, more usual pumpkins. At first, I thought it was just an illusion, but as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't. It was massive, easily 3 times the size of any other pumpkin in the field. Its shape was odd, too perfect, like it had been carefully placed there. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the way it seemed to almost watch me. The ridges of its skin seemed to shift slightly in the low light, like the pumpkin was alive, as if it had a presence, something that didn't belong. I shook my head, thinking I was just tired and letting my imagination run wild. But still, there it sat, staring up at me from the dirt. I turned away, trying to focus on the work at hand, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. I grabbed the broom again and went to make another pass, but before I could get too far, I heard something. A faint sound, like a whisper, low and distant. It wasn't the wind. I had been in this field enough to know the difference. The whisper came again, this time louder, as if it was just out of sight. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and I spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was nothing, just the pumpkins, the dim light from the barn door, and the silence that seemed to press in on me. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the wind was probably playing tricks on me. But even as I rationalized, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I looked back at the giant pumpkin. It still sat there, unmoved, almost too still. My eyes locked onto it for a moment, and I couldn't help but feel an odd pull, like something was drawing me in. I took a step closer. The whisper came again, this time from the far end of the patch, closer to the row where the large pumpkin sat. My heart skipped, and I took a step back. The whispering seemed to linger in the air, like it was carrying through the rows of pumpkins, wrapping itself around me. It was faint, almost like it was in the distance, but the quietness of the field amplified it, making it feel much closer than it actually was. I felt a chill run down my spine. Without thinking, I turned away and ran. My feet pounded against the dirt, the broom slipping from my hand as I bolted back to the barn. My pulse thudded in my ears, and my breath came in short bursts as I flung open the barn door and slammed it shut behind me. I leaned against the wall, trying to calm myself down. It was just my nerves, I told myself. I'd been out in the fields too long. The whispering was just the wind, and the pumpkin. It was just a pumpkin. It couldn't do anything. I stood there for a minute, my heart still racing. After a few deep breaths, I grabbed my jacket and started walking toward the barn door. The field was still out there, just as I had left it. The light from the barn cast long shadows across the rows of pumpkins. I couldn't hear anything. No whispering. No sound at all. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. I stepped outside, keeping my eyes on the ground, just wanted to finish up and go home. When I reached the row where the giant pumpkin had been, I stopped dead in my tracks. It was gone. The place where it had sat was empty, the dirt disturbed, as if something heavy had been dragged away. The ground was torn up, deep gouges running through the earth, the marks fresh like something large had been moved across the field. There was no sign of the pumpkin, no trace of it anywhere, just the deep ruts in the dirt. I stood there, staring at the empty patch, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The whispering came back to me, and my stomach tightened. The wind wasn't blowing. There was no reason for the dirt to be disturbed like this, not unless something had happened, something that wasn't normal. I didn't wait around to investigate further. I ran back to the barn, grabbed my things, and didn't look back as I left the farm. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not because I didn't want to know, I was scared. I wasn't sure what had happened that night, but I knew what I had felt and what I had seen. The next day, when I returned to the patch, the ground was undisturbed. There was no sign of any strange gouges and no trace of a large pumpkin. It was as if nothing had happened at all, but I knew better. I didn't stay on the farm much longer after that. Something about that place, about that night, left me with a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I never worked at that patch again. The pumpkin was gone, the dirt was clean, and everything seemed normal. But I don't think I'll ever forget how it felt, standing in that patch, watching something I couldn't understand vanish into the dark. It was a feeling that stayed with me long after I left. I've been feeling the weight of everything lately. Work, life, the usual grind. Halloween was just around the corner, and I was looking for some peace before the chaos of the weekend hit. So, I decided to take a hike up a local trail I knew well. It wasn't anything challenging, just a couple of miles to get some fresh air and clear my head. The trail wasn't too far from my place, and I'd walked it plenty of times before, so I figured it'd be easy enough. It was late afternoon when I started, the sun still hanging high in the sky. The weather was perfect, crisp, cool air with a slight breeze rustling through the trees. As I walked, the sounds of the city gradually faded, replaced by the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional bird call. The trail snaked up into the woods, winding between tall oaks and pines. I hadn't planned on being out long, maybe an hour or so, just enough time to get some space from everything. But I lost track of time, as you do when the rhythm of walking takes over. I didn't notice how the light started to fade, how the shadows grew longer, or how the sky slowly darkened. By the time I looked up and realized the sun was nearly gone, I was farther out than I'd intended. I paused, checking my watch. It was getting late. The parking lot at the trailhead would be empty soon, and I didn't want to be out here in the dark. I turned around, telling myself it wouldn't take long to head back, that I had plenty of time. But the woods were different in the fading light. The air felt heavier somehow, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The usual chirps of birds had quieted, leaving behind an unnatural stillness. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the soft crunch of the forest floor beneath my feet. It felt wrong, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I shook the thought from my head, telling myself it was just the darkness creeping in, making everything feel strange. But every few steps I heard something, a crack, a snap, not from a branch overhead, but from behind me, like someone stepping on the dry leaves and twigs scattered across the ground. I stopped. My breath caught for a second. I turned around, scanning the trail behind me. There was nothing, just the trees stretching out into the dark, the path empty and still. I told myself it was nothing. The wind must have picked up, or maybe a squirrel or something was moving around in the underbrush. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I kept walking, picking up my pace, the sound of crunching leaves growing louder, closer. It wasn't my imagination anymore. Someone, or something, was following me. I glanced over my shoulder again, this time walking faster. The path was familiar, but now it seemed different. The trees looked darker, the shadows deeper. My breath was coming quicker, the rhythm of my footsteps picking up as I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. But the noises kept coming. A snap, a crunch. Closer this time, right behind me. I knew I couldn't be imagining it. Someone was out there, and they were following me. I quickened my pace to a jog, my heart pounding in my chest. The air seemed colder now, the darkness pressing in around me. I was moving too fast to pay attention to the trail anymore, not caring if I lost my footing or tripped. I just needed to get out of the woods. With every step, the sound behind me grew louder. It was almost like whoever was there was mimicking my movements, matching my steps with perfect timing. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the fear setting in. I wasn't a runner. I wasn't even in great shape, but I pushed myself harder, desperate to get back to the parking lot, to the safety of my car. I told myself that it was nothing, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I was being followed. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw the faint glow of the parking lot lights through the trees. Relief flooded over me, but it was short-lived. As I neared the edge of the trail, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My car was the only one left in the lot. The lot was almost empty when I'd first arrived, but I hadn't thought much of it then. Now it struck me. Everyone had left, and I had been out there long enough that the parking lot should have been full. I reached the edge of the trail and stopped dead in my tracks. My feet felt frozen to the ground, and it wasn't from the cold. I looked around, my eyes scanning the lot. Nothing. But then my gaze turned to the trees, to the place where the trail veered off into the woods. There, just barely visible in the fading light, was a large tree. One I recognized. I had passed that tree on my way up the trail, and now I was sure of it. I had passed it again. My stomach twisted. I had been walking in a straight line, hadn't I? I should have been back at the lot by now. But no matter how hard I tried to remember, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had passed that tree 3 times. It wasn't possible. I'd been following the same path back, but something had gone wrong. My footsteps hadn't led me straight. I had circled back somehow, gone in a loop, without even realizing it. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had been following me. They hadn't just been walking behind me, they'd been moving in the same loop, forcing me to go in circles, trapping me. The sound of the crunching leaves, the quiet, the strange stillness. It had all been deliberate, a way to mess with me, to make me feel like I was losing my mind. I stood there for a moment, rooted to the spot, my breath shallow and quick. I wanted to run, to jump in my car and drive away, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the trail. I turned slowly, trying not to make a sound, my heart racing. And then I heard it again. The crunch of leaves, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was someone walking toward me. I didn't wait for anything else. I didn't look back. I ran toward my car as fast as I could, my legs burning with the effort, the air thick in my lungs. I didn't stop until I was safely inside, doors locked, engine roaring to life. As I sped out of the lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The woods were dark, silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had been there, following me, watching me. Halloween had always been my favorite night of the year, a time when the streets were full of life and chaos, when everyone became someone else for a few hours. That year, I went out with a small group of friends. We wandered from house to house on Elm Street, bags in hand, collecting candy and enjoying the crisp autumn air. The leaves crunched underfoot. The orange glow of jack-o'-lanterns lit up the porches, and the occasional gust of wind carried the smell of smoke from chimneys and wood fires. Everything felt normal, festive, the kind of night that belonged in photographs or memory. But there was one house that everyone avoided. It was at the far end of the street, older than the others, with paint peeling off the siding and a sagging porch. The windows were covered with thick, heavy curtains, the kind that blocked out every scrap of light. No lights, no decorations, no sound. The kind of place you noticed because it didn't belong, because it seemed deliberately quiet in a street that was otherwise alive with children and laughter. My friends always told stories about it. How no one had lived there for years, how it had been abandoned, how it was the creepiest house on the block. I had passed it plenty of times before, but I had never gotten close. That night, the dare came up. One of my friends nudged me forward, daring me knock. I hesitated at first. The house had a stillness to it that made the hairs on my neck prickle. The front yard was overgrown, the walkway cracked and uneven. Dead leaves had piled up against the porch steps, and the front door had a dark, weathered stain that made it look older than it probably was. I stepped forward, the soles of my sneakers making soft, scraping noises against the concrete. My hand lifted, shaking slightly, and I knocked. Almost immediately, I heard something. Music. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. It sounded old, the kind of tune that might have come from a phonograph or a piano in a silent film. It wasn't loud, just enough to make the air feel heavier, like it was pressing in around me. I looked back at my friends. They were frozen on the sidewalk, watching, half excited, half scared. I took a deep breath and knocked again, louder this time. The door creaked open, slowly. There was no one there, no sound of footsteps, no answering voice. Just a dark, narrow hallway that seemed to stretch away into shadow. The music was clearer now, a soft tinkling that seemed to come from inside the house. Against every instinct, I stepped forward. The wooden floorboards groaned under my weight, dust rising in faint clouds with each step. The air smelled dry and stale, like the house hadn't been lived in for decades. My friends called out to me from the street, their voices distant, but I didn't answer. I couldn't. Every step brought a mixture of fear and curiosity that pinned me in place. When I reached the center of the room, the door slammed shut behind me. The sudden sound echoed off the walls, sharp and final, and I jumped. I ran to the door, tugging at the handle, but it was locked or stuck. I couldn't tell. Panic started to creep in, a gnawing sensation in my stomach. The music kept playing, soft and persistent, coming from somewhere deeper inside. I turned slowly, trying to take in the room, trying to make sense of it. The interior was coated in dust. Everything was covered. Tables, chairs, a small piano against the far wall. Cobwebs draped across the corners, clinging to the ceiling and walls. The wallpaper had peeled in long strips, revealing blotches of faded paint and cracked plaster underneath. It was silent except for the music, the kind of quiet that makes every tiny sound feel magnified. I could hear the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, the settling of the house in the night, the soft rustle of the curtains as a draft moved through the room. The music seemed to follow me, coming from no particular place, like it was trapped in the air itself. And then I saw it, a figure standing in the corner. At first, I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the low light, but it didn't move. Not like a shadow would. The outline was human, solid, but vague, like a dark shape caught between the furniture and the wall. My chest tightened. I wanted to tell myself it was just an old coat hanging there or a stack of furniture, but my eyes refused to look away. The music stopped, just like that, as if it had been holding its breath, waiting for me to notice. The sudden silence was worse than the music, pressing down on me, heavy and oppressive. I took a cautious step forward, heart hammering. The figure didn't move. I tried to call out to say something, but my voice stuck in my throat. The dust motes and the light from the window seemed to float in the air, motionless, as if time had slowed. I realized I could hear my own breathing, my pulse thudding in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to leave, but I couldn't tear my eyes from that corner. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to move. Slowly, I backed toward the door, one careful step at a time. My hand found the handle again. This time it gave way. The door swung open with a reluctant groan, and I stumbled onto the porch, gasping for air. I didn't stop to look back. The street felt alive, full of movement, the distant laughter of children a comfort after the oppressive quiet inside. I ran down the sidewalk to my friends, who were still standing where they had left me, frozen but relieved to see me. When I turned back toward the house, the windows were dark again. The curtains hung still, heavy as ever. The music, the figure, the sense of being watched, all gone. My friends asked if I was okay, and I nodded, but I didn't say a word about what I'd seen. I didn't want to explain it because there was nothing to explain, nothing that made sense. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't impossible. It was just there a moment in time when the house had felt alive, when I had walked into a place that hadn't been touched for years and felt that someone or something was waiting for me. We continued the rest of the night, moving from house to house, but I avoided that end of the street entirely. I never went back to that house, and I never asked about it. Even now, years later, I can remember the smell of dust, the way the floorboards groaned under my weight, the sound of the faint music, and the way it stopped when I saw the figure. I know there was nothing supernatural about it, just a house abandoned and left to time. But the memory stays with me because it was real. I felt it, I experienced it, and for a few moments, the world outside didn't exist. I had stepped into a space frozen in the past, and I had come out alone. That night on Elm Street remains the most unsettling experience I've ever had, not because of what was there, but because of how human it all felt. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. It wasn't much, a small cabin nestled in the mountains, far from the nearest town. The listing had promised it was secluded, which was exactly what I wanted. I needed time alone, away from the constant noise of everyday life. No calls, no emails, no interruptions. Just me, nature, and a few quiet days to recharge. It sounded perfect. The cabin was a 2-hour drive from the nearest gas station, and I was grateful for the solitude. As the road wound higher into the mountains, the trees grew thicker, the air colder. The GPS stopped working about halfway through the drive, and I relied on the handwritten directions the host had sent me. There was a point where the asphalt ended and the road became a narrow dirt trail, rough and bumpy, but manageable. I felt a rush of excitement as I drove deeper into the wilderness. There was something about being that far away from everything that made me feel alive. When I finally arrived, it was just as I expected, small, rustic, and isolated. The cabin was tucked among a cluster of pines, almost hidden from view unless you were standing directly in front of it. The porch was worn, the wood cracked in places, but it had character. The kind of character that made it feel like a place where time slowed down. I unloaded my things, took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air, and settled in. I was alone, and for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. The first night, I stayed inside, enjoying the warmth of the fire crackling in the stone fireplace. The walls of the cabin were thin, and every creak and groan of the wood seemed to echo in the quiet of the night. Around midnight, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, faint knocking. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, but it was distinct, rhythmic. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just the wind or the cabin settling, but the sound continued. 3 knocks, followed by a pause, then 3 more. It didn't stop, and it didn't sound random. It was too deliberate. I got up from the bed and walked to the window, peering through the blinds. The outside was dark, nothing but a stretch of snow and trees. The trees swayed gently, but the air was still. I couldn't see anything unusual. No animals, no movement. The knock came again, just as faint as before. My heart raced a little, but I tried to calm myself. It was probably just an animal, I thought. A branch tapping against the wall, or something like that. I shrugged it off and went back to bed, locking the door behind me. I kept the lamp on for a while, listening, but the knocking stopped. I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing it in the back of my mind. The next morning, I awoke to find the cabin covered in a fresh blanket of snow. It had snowed overnight, and the ground was pristine. I stepped outside, breathing in the cold, clean air. There was no sign of any tracks in the snow around the cabin. Nothing unusual. But as I walked toward the edge of the porch, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Deep footprints. Fresh ones. The prints were large, too large to belong to any animal I knew, and they led right up to the front door. The snow around them was untouched, as if whatever made them had come straight from the trees and walked right up to the cabin. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the prints. There was no sign of any other tracks around the area. The snow was too clean, too undisturbed. The footprints didn't make sense. They weren't the kind of tracks an animal would leave. They were too deliberate, spaced evenly apart, like someone had walked right up to the door and then turned back into the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I felt exposed, vulnerable, even though I was miles from anyone. I spent the rest of the morning inside, pacing the cabin, staring out the windows. The woods were quiet, too quiet. The air had no birds, no rustling leaves, just the eerie silence of the snow-covered trees. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe someone else had been up here before me, someone who had walked through the snow early in the morning. But the more I thought about it, the more it didn't add up. No one had passed me on the road, and there was no way anyone could have gotten here without me noticing. I had seen the road before I parked the car. There was no other vehicle, no sign of life. Just my own. I checked the door, making sure it was locked. The last thing I wanted was to be outside in the snow, trying to fend off whatever had left those footprints. As the day wore on, the isolation of the cabin felt suffocating. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the snow. I locked all the windows, double-checked the doors, and decided to wait it out. I would leave first thing in the morning, head back to the nearest town. But for now, I would stay inside, away from whatever was out there. The night passed uneventfully, though sleep was difficult. Every noise in the cabin made me jump. Every creak of the wood felt like someone was walking around. I spent hours staring at the door, half expecting to hear another knock, but it never came. By morning, I was exhausted, but I was determined to leave. The sun was up, and the footprints had been covered by fresh snow, but I wasn't sticking around to find out what had made them. I packed up my things in a rush, moving quickly, not bothering to check the cabin again. As I pulled away, the road seemed longer, the trees closing in around me. I didn't look back. I drove without stopping, my hands tied on the wheel, my mind racing. I didn't know what had happened there, whether someone had been watching me or if it was just a trick of the mind, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back. When I reached the town, I stopped at the first gas station I found. The attendant looked at me strangely when I asked about the cabin. He told me that people rarely rented that place out, and when they did, they usually didn't stay long. He didn't say anything more, just shrugged and told me to stay away from the mountains when the snow was heavy. People get lost up there, he said, as if that explained everything. I never found out what those footprints were, But as I drove away, I realized something. Whatever had happened out there, I was never meant to know. We had been driving for hours, the kind of road trip that starts with excitement and slowly bleeds into exhaustion. It was late October, the sky gray and heavy with clouds, the kind of weather that made the autumn trees along the highway glow brighter in contrast. The four of us had started the morning in the city, but now we were far beyond anything resembling civilization. The traffic had thinned to nothing, the roads narrowing and curving between endless stretches of forest. It was beautiful in a quiet, lonely way, but also unsettling, the isolation growing heavier with every mile. We were laughing and talking at first, music playing from the car speakers, but eventually, conversation had faded into the soft hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional wind stirring the treetops. Somewhere along that stretch, my friend spotted a small diner off the side of the road. It wasn't much, painted a dull cream, with red trim and a single neon sign that flickered faintly in the overcast light, but it promised warmth and coffee, a break from the monotony of the highway. The parking lot was empty except for a car. We walked inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. The air smelled faintly of fried food and bleach, and it felt oddly cold, like the interior had been chilled for decades. The only person, there was an elderly woman behind the counter. She had a tight, nervous smile, hands folded on the worn Formica surface, and eyes that seemed to watch us more closely than necessary. She motioned for us to sit, moving quickly to take our orders with a precision that almost seemed rehearsed. She warned us, subtly, almost as if she didn't want to speak the words aloud. She gestured toward a small road that veered off the highway just beyond the diner. She didn't elaborate, only saying it was bad luck, a line that made us laugh nervously. It felt like an old superstition, a story meant to scare teenagers. We nodded, thanked her, and went out, the words lingering in the back of my mind but easily dismissed. It was easy to laugh at warnings when nothing seemed wrong, when the sun was still high and the day felt normal. We took the road anyway. It started narrow, flanked by thick stands of pine and oak, the branches forming a rough canopy overhead. The asphalt was cracked in places, patched over again and again, and we joked about the state of rural infrastructure. But after a few miles, the road began to feel different. The scenery didn't change. The same trees, the same bends in the road, the same gray sky. I checked the map on my phone, but the signal was gone. Nothing registered beyond our little blip, and even that seemed wrong. We were still moving, still counting miles in the cabin of the car, but it was impossible to gauge how far we had gone. Every turn looked familiar, every bend repeated. After a while, the conversation in the car faded. The laughter stopped. My friends glanced nervously out the windows, noticing the same trees, the same broken patches of asphalt. It was disorienting. It felt like we had been driving forever, yet the diner, the starting point, wasn't anywhere to be found. We tried turning back. I took a hairpin bend, following the route we had come, expecting to see a familiar sign, the neon flicker of the diner. Nothing, just more trees, more endless gray road, stretching into the horizon like a loop with no exit. Hours passed. The sun began to set, though there had been no morning to measure against the afternoon. Shadows grew long and deep, the trees casting jagged patterns across the windshield. The car lights cut through the dimming light, illuminating only the road immediately ahead. Every mile felt the same, the pattern of cracks and patches repeating in a way that made it impossible to trust distance or direction. I kept expecting the familiar blue and white sign of the diner to appear, but it never did. Every road branching off looked identical, every marker the same. We stopped once, trying to get a signal on our phones. No service, no GPS, nothing. The frustration and fear began to build slowly, a tension in my chest I couldn't shake. The forest seemed too dense, too unchanging. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the smell of wet leaves and moss. It wasn't night yet, but the dim light made everything feel muted and cold. I realized that we had no sense of direction. We could drive forever and never find the diner or the highway we had come from. At some point, the first cracks of panic appeared. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white. My friends were quiet, each absorbed in the same growing sense of unease. The road curved again, then again, repeating in a way that made me certain we had driven this exact stretch multiple times. The familiarity was subtle, but it was there. I tried to mark a tree, a broken fence post, a bend in the asphalt, but nothing was unique. Everything mirrored itself, creating the sensation of a perpetual loop. We finally decided to keep driving, hoping the pattern would break. Hours stretched into darkness. Headlights reflected off the trunks of trees that seemed impossibly tall, impossibly close. The road was empty. No cars, no signs, no lights from houses. It was just us and the black ribbon of asphalt, the sky growing darker above. We had eaten the last of the snacks we had brought, drank the last of the water, and still there was no sign of civilization. Exhaustion began to weigh heavily, pressing down physically and mentally. It was impossible to relax, impossible to close my eyes for even a second. Eventually, we stopped again, this time realizing that we had to make a choice. Keep driving until something changed, or stop and accept the uncertainty. My friend suggested pulling over, but there was nowhere to safely stop. The shoulder was narrow, uneven, and littered with debris. I kept the engine running, lights cutting through the dark, scanning the trees for any indication that we're moving forward. But there was none. Then, as the sky grew nearly black, I noticed a subtle change. The cracks in the road, the pattern of the trees, even the smell of the air began to shift. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be measured, but enough to signal movement. The horizon lightened slightly in one direction, a faint glimmer of possibility, like the sun or distant city lights, barely perceptible. I drove toward it cautiously, not daring to stop, not daring to glance away. Eventually, the road widened. We passed a familiar street sign, one I recognized from the map, and a few miles later, the first faint lights of the town appeared. The diner was gone. There was no trace of it, but the main highway stretched before us, familiar and solid. Relief washed over me slowly, unsteady, as if I had been holding my breath for hours without knowing it. The fear began to fade, leaving only exhaustion and disbelief. Looking back, I realized that the diner, the warning, and the strange stretch of road had all been real, but grounded in human experience. The waitress's warning, the endless loop, the disorientation, they were the result of unfamiliar terrain, fatigue, and isolation. Nothing supernatural, nothing inexplicable, just a combination of factors that made sense once I returned to the safety of the familiar. But for those hours, it felt endless, suffocating, and entirely believable. The road had played tricks on us, and for a while, I had truly believed there was no way back. I don't drive that route anymore. I don't think I will. Even when I close my eyes, I can feel the stretch of asphalt under the tires, the shadow of trees repeating endlessly, and the small, quiet diner that may never have existed. I had heard about the old amusement park on the outskirts of town for months. Everyone seemed to have a story about it. Half-remembered rumors, warnings from parents, tales of kids sneaking in when they were teenagers. Halloween felt like the perfect night to see it for myself. The combination of darkness, autumn chill, and the thrill of trespassing made it impossible to resist. I drove out there late in the evening, the air turning cold and damp as the city faded behind me, replaced by stretches of empty road and overgrown fields. The park's entrance was marked by a rusty archway, the paint peeling and the letters barely legible. The gate itself had long been ripped from its hinges, leaning slightly to one side, giving the sense that the place had been abandoned for decades. I parked at the edge of the lot, grabbed my backpack and flashlight, and slipped inside. The smell hit me immediately, a mixture of rust, mildew, and decaying metal. It was heavy and unpleasant, clinging to the inside of my nose. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, littered with fallen leaves, broken glass, and scraps of paper. Every step made a crunching noise that echoed in the emptiness. The ride sat frozen, rust eating into steel, paint faded to dull tones, the skeletal remains of what had once been lively and colorful. A carousel leaned slightly to one side, horses frozen in mid-gallop, their eyes chipped and dull. The Ferris wheel loomed ahead, motionless, its cars swaying slightly in the breeze. The entire park was silent, the kind of silence that pressed down, making every small noise, the scraping of my shoes, the faint whistle of wind, feel enormous. I wandered deeper, flashlight cutting through the shadows. I traced the outlines of the main walkway, past the ticket booths and snack stands, stepping carefully over cracked concrete and exposed roots. The closer I got to the Ferris wheel, the heavier the air felt. I noticed the shadows it cast, long and distorted, stretching across the ground like thin fingers. It was easy to imagine the rides moving, the screams of children, the smells of popcorn and sugar, but there was nothing but silence and the cold, the quiet pressing in on me from all sides. I rounded the Ferris wheel and stopped for a moment, scanning the area. That's when I heard it, the faintest hint of music. Carnival music, tinny and distorted, like it was coming from a broken record player. My stomach tightened. I froze, shining the flashlight around, trying to locate the source. Nothing moved. No lights, no signs of life. The music continued, soft and uneven, and then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. My pulse accelerated. I checked my phone without thinking, hoping to ground myself in something familiar. That's when I realized the time had skipped. Hours. The screen said it was almost midnight, but when I had entered the park, it had barely been evening. I hadn't noticed the passage of time, not until the abrupt shift made it impossible to ignore. I took a step back, heart pounding, telling myself it was just a combination of losing track of time and my mind playing tricks. The long walk through the empty park, the constant shifting shadows, and the oppressive silence could make anyone feel disoriented. I started walking toward the exit, keeping my flashlight aimed at the ground, careful to avoid broken glass and debris. I didn't want to look at the rides, didn't want to imagine the ghosts of the past still moving them. Every sound seemed amplified. A branch snapping, the scrape of metal, the soft thud of a loose Ferris wheel car swaying in the wind. As I approached the base of the Ferris wheel, I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. I swung the flashlight quickly toward it and saw a figure retreating behind one of the cars. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a ghost, and it wasn't supernatural. It was human, someone crouched, moving quietly, watching me. The sight sent a jolt of fear through me, a primal instinct that screamed to get out of there. I realized the figure had been hiding, probably for hours, maybe longer, taking advantage of the darkness and the abandoned structures. Whoever it was had the element of surprise. The thought of confrontation made my stomach churn. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran toward the exit, my flashlight bobbing, catching glimpses of rusted rails and broken rides. The crunch of leaves and gravel beneath my shoes sounded deafening in the emptiness. Behind me, I thought I heard movement, but I didn't look back. I just ran, forcing my legs to carry me faster than they had all night. The wind bit at my face, and my backpack swung against my shoulders. The archway at the entrance appeared finally, dim and crooked in the beam of my flashlight. I reached my car, hands shaking, keys fumbling in the ignition. I started the engine and glanced in the rearview mirror. The park was still there, dark and silent, but the figure had vanished. There was no sign anyone had been following me at all. No footprints, no shadows, no hint of a person. I drove away slowly at first, then faster, the radio still silent, my thoughts replaying every step I had taken, every sound I had heard. For the rest of the night, I tried to rationalize it. The jump in time could have been me losing track, letting the dark and the silence warp my perception. The music had been a broken speaker or a recording left behind. The figure had been someone else exploring the park, hiding for their own amusement. All plausible, logical explanations. And yet, the fear I had felt was real. The impression of being watched, the pressure in the air, the sensation of time shifting all of it had been real in my experience. I didn't return to the park. I haven't spoken much about it since. Even now, I can remember the smell of rust and mildew, the creak of the Ferris wheel, the way the shadows moved under my flashlight. I can feel the subtle shift in the air when I imagine walking through it again, the sense that something or someone might still be there, hidden just beyond the light. It was real, entirely human, and entirely terrifying. And that, more than anything, is why I will never go back.